All right, let's get going. Good afternoon. We're going to talk about security here. So I hope you're in the right place. If so, great. Probably there will be some things that you will be like, duh. If that is the case, just take that as a sign that you are on the right track. Because unfortunately, in many cases, it turns out that even the simplest things are not always familiar to everybody. But first, I want to start with a question to all of you. Do you understand this reference? Who understands this reference? Who knows actually where this picture is taken? King's Cross Station in London. It's basically the thing that references to the Harry Potter movies, and Harry needs to go to platform 9 3/4, and normally 9 3/4 doesn't exist because there's platform 9 and platform 10. But it turns out if you are on the right time, with the right amount of luggage, with the right tools, and you put the right amount of pressure at the right spot on the wall, you magically get into platform 9 3/4. Unfortunately, most of you are all hopefully just core developers. Are there any security expert here in the room? All right. So in most cases, we think like, looks good on my machine, works on my machine, all tests are green, we're impenetrable, and I am the best developer in the world. Unfortunately, it does happen that if I am there at the right time with the right tools, at the right spot, with the right amount of force, that people still can get in. But let's take a look to understand that better. Let's take a look at how we develop software. And yes, I'm very good at drawing because say this is our piece of software. This is our little shed or a little pool house that we're trying to build. It's very scoped. It's very well based. It's basically what we call an MVP or a POC or whatever you might call it, what kind of name you have for it. And we know always from an MVP or a POC that once it's in production, it's not just an MVP or a proof of concept, it stays in production in many cases. And what happens is this works well, it's very well done in a limited amount of time, and then most cases, some product manager or somebody from the business comes up to you says, okay, now we have seen this, we have this tiny little addition that we want you to add to your nice little proof of concept. And you're like, it's kind of out of scope, but not really, it makes sense. So you're like, okay, sure. So we built something next to it. And this still makes sense. And it works. And it's a success. And people start working around it and working with it. And then management, upper management comes up to you and say the magic words that from a business perspective, it makes sense if we connect whatever you have to this feature base. And you're like, I don't think so. But in the end, they pay the money. So you're like, sure, whatever you want, boss. So you built something on top of something else. Well, actually, the foundation was not built for that. Normally, you should rebuild it. But no. We already have this, right? So we can reuse it. That's what they think on top. And that happens all over and all over again because they're like, if we can build this, then we can definitely build this, and it makes sense, and we have more leverage towards our customers or our competitors, and we build things on things. We might break it half off while it's not even in production yet. And in the end, we end up with an application that started as a little shed, but now can talk to the moon and fly helicopters. If I draw this out as a structural building, everybody's like, yeah, that's stupid. However, we tend to do this when creating software. Guess what? Do you think this building is secure, is safe? Do you want to live in this building with your family? Some people are like, yeah, sure. It's cheap. I won't. But it's how we create software. It's how we create bugs in that case, because we don't look back at what we're doing. We're only building on top of things. And this is also, while not just only performance issues, but also security issues happen. Because if you know that this is pretty much the strategy of how you build, then again, think about this. If I have the right tools at the right spot, and I just put the right amount of force on that, I will probably get in. By the way, I'm Brian. I am a staff developer advocate for Sneak. Basically means half of my time is programming and doing stuff. The other half of the time is, I say, presenting on stage, but more or less it's drinking beer. But never mind. Oh, it's recorded. It's not true. Anyway, I do some stuff in the community. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I co-lead the Netherlands Java user group, among a few other things, but this is not the most important part. We're going to some of the things that might be familiar to you, or might not be familiar to you. But again, what I said in the beginning, if you see like, okay, this is well known to us and I never do that, good to you. But remember to also transfer that knowledge to your new developer, your new junior that comes on your team. Because most of the times, at least for me, when I was in engineering school, when I was at university, I had some principles, but most of them were about building software, not so much about penetrating software or getting into software or breaking things. So let's start with the most easy one. Most applications, specifically in backend enterprise development, are, I've got an application, I need to put in some information, and it needs to be stored in a data store. So you probably already know that SQL is not only a SQL language, or is about querying databases. Unless you're in marketing, then it's about sales qualified leads, and then you please need to leave the room now. We're going to talk about databases. Who has never written a SQL query? Some people are like, I don't know. It's fine. You're not getting taped. I'm getting recorded. Anyway, most of you know SQL, so can somebody explain to me what these two things mean in SQL? The first one is end of statement. The second one is comment. And these are a hacker's best friend if we're going into SQL injection. Because with one part, I can just cut off a query. With the other part, I can just put the rest of the query, put it in as comment. And then I can start mingling around. So I have an application over here. And let's not get into the application, into the code yet, but let's just see if it starts. That's always the problem here with live demos. It's a Spring Boot application with the front end in Timeleaf. So let's see if that works. It starts up, it creates data for me. Great. Let's go to localhost. I think it was on 8082. Cool. One of the things I can do over here is I can search my product by name or description, which means I can do something like, hey, maybe it works with pie, and I get Seattle pie. Or I can just put something in, and it will get something back from the description. So it works both on the name and the description. Well, that is great. But now let's look how we implemented this. Getting back to my code, I used JPA. And now I have to look where I put the actual code. And I'm going to cheat a little, because obviously this has a SQL vulnerability in it. And I will enlarge it in a second. Bear with me. So, in this method, I chose to do a create native query using Spring and JPA. And the reason to use Spring and JPA, because it was easy. But I wanted to do something more than, no, in this case not, but normally I wanted to do something more, and I wanted to here do an OR query, but say I want to do something with joins or unions or that kind of stuff. It's not that easy to do it with the Spring JPA repositories. So maybe, as I am just a developer, I was like, okay, I can go do a create native query. I had some SQL back in high school or in university, and just do this. And obviously what I did, the input over here is set to lowercase, and that lowercase value is now part of my string. As you probably all know, this is not the best way to do this, because now your parameter is part of your query, and that influences the execution order of your statement. Normally, if it's just a value, it's no problem at all. But if I'm going to use these two things, like the semicolon and the dash dash, basically what I say now is over here, let's cut this one off and do some things in the middle, and the rest of the query is comment. So what I can do, obviously this doesn't work, but what I can do is something like this. So I need to make it actual SQL, so I need to end it with a single, how do you call these things? Commas, thank you. My semicolon breaks off the current query, so it's basically saying nothing. Where is nothing. Then I just update all the products because I told you I am Dutch. I'm a freeloader. I like cheap. So I set the price to 0, and the rest of the query is now considered comments. And by submitting this, it's like, oh, this doesn't work unless you just do this and you see all the prices are 0 and my Dutch heart goes bouncy, bouncy, bouncy. It likes a lot. Like, I like free stuff. If we go back into theory, as in you probably had this, you probably understand this, it's like, okay, how can we solve this? And I know that there are a bunch of senior developers or even sub-senior or over-senior developers over here. How should we solve this in Java? There are two different ways. Some would say prepared statements, and some would say parameterized queries. And I would say it's both. It's prepared statements with parameterized queries, because you can create a prepared statement, but if you don't parameterize your queries, then it doesn't work, simply. On the other hand, parameterized queries do not always use prepared statements. And I will tell you the difference here. If you look at back how you do this normally in Java with a direct connection, you see this is the problem. We have the parameter over here as part of the query, and I can do something like this. Basically what I did already, but this is just plain Java without the JPA stuff and the create native query in Spring. If you look at your textbooks, you probably find something like this. Hey, we can create a prepared statement, connect to prepared statement, and then set the string or set the parameter as the first thing here, which is now a question mark, as you can see here. Okay, cool. But what is the difference, actually, the whole thing? Well, a prepared statement basically takes the query with the wildcards, send it as a first step to the database, and already gives that to the DBMS. The DBMS has the opportunity to create the execution order already with some blanks in it. Then, as a second step, I implement the variables, and then I send it to it. But the execution order is already created. So it's impossible to use my parameters to influence the execution order or partially neglect the execution order, because it's already created. It has two things that are beneficial to you. The first thing is, we can store this and we can cache this. That means the second time we do this, the execution order of this thing is already part of your database system. And the next time you put a query in, if you do that multiple times, the DBMS already knows how to handle that because it doesn't have to recompute the execution order. The second thing is the parameter cannot influence it, so we cannot break it and do other things except for what we mean. But sure, this what you showed was regular Java. How to do this in this Spring application, because you are using JPA. First of all, I can do this in Java. But the first thing is, I'm using JPA. What is the default implementation for JPA in a Spring Boot application? A lot of people are like, I actually don't know. And that's okay. It's Hibernate. However, it's not a given that it's always Hibernate. It depends on how you configured your application, or if you use JPA, what kind of implementation you use. Because JPA is nothing more than a reference. JPA is a standard. Let's say it so. There are different ways to implement it. Even if I parameterize my queries, and I can do that quite easily because I already have an example over here, maybe not the best example, but if I uncomment this, you will see that I have a query here, and I use a wildcard over here, and a second wildcard over here, and then as a second step, I set the parameters. But do I know if Hibernate is actually using a prepared statement? Or does it the other way around? What a lot of JavaScript applications do is try to escape it on the client side and still send it as a complete query to the database. Obviously, that is less safe, because you can if you know how it's escaped, you probably can make countermeasures to it. It's still harder, but it's not impossible. If you're just using Hibernate, at this point you're safe, because Hibernate under the hood uses prepared statements. But the thing is, you don't know if you're just using Spring and you're like clickety clickety click, put that thing in, hey, tada, it works. That looks all fine, unless you're doing weird things like this. So you need to know what your implementation is to make sure that it actually works. So first thing you need to do, what is your implementation of JPA? What are you actually using for library under the hood, and how do they work with this? Then secondly, if you're you can use the JPA repositories, because the JPA repositories under the hood use Hibernate, and they already escape it and use prepared statements for you. Unless you're using another implementation of JPA, but then it's different. However, in some cases, you're not able to use the JPA repository implementation, and you need to do it like I did with the create native query. But you can still use a create native query with named parameters, and then you're safe. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, if you use this, know what your standards are before you're actually going forward. SQL injection, unfortunately, is still on the top list of the OS top 10. And that's for a reason, because it happens so much, because people don't know how it's implemented. And unfortunately, if something goes wrong, we probably all do some sort of DevOps, DevSecOps, or what kind of buzzword is nowadays hyped. But it will come back to you as the engineering team to fix it. Then you actually need to know, and you probably want to prevent that before you go into production. Obviously, you can check this, because I already showed you a little bit that I have a tool over here which scans it during coding to see, like, hey, do you have a problem here? And it already says, Brian, you have a SQL injection here on your home controller. So if I click on this, it comes back and it says, like, hey, it starts on your home controller on line 29, and it goes all the way to line 25. And there we have it. And there it comes back to that. So I can get this feedback right away while I'm developing. And that, for me personally, that's a great thing, because I don't want to wait until it's done in my CI system. Because I spent time on it, I worked on it, it's part of a larger feature, and then in my CI system it might break and it says, hey, Brian, you have a SQL injection problem here, possibly. Then I need to do all the rethinking again. If I do it now, I'm in the same context. So it's easier for me to fix it right away. All right, that was an easy one, right? Everybody knows what SQL is, SQL injection, and you're like, oh, yeah, Dad, am I here for just SQL injection talks? No, you're not. Because we have more. We have way more. Let's go to file uploads. I think file uploads is one of the favorite things of a malicious person, because you can do all kind of nasty stuff with that. So with file uploads, I mean, say I have something like this, an application that I want to choose a file and say, hey, I want to upload that image and do something with it. Obviously, I have this in my application over here. This application, I can log in. What was my password again? I think it was user, right? Yes, because it's super safe. I work for a security company, I'm fine. Trust me. But I'm not using my normal browser, I'm going to use something different. I'm going to use Burp Suite. And I will tell you in a second why. Burp Suite is a nice little tool specifically used for pen testing. I will use this, I will start Burp Suite. And I'm using Burp Suite now to intercept whatever I'm doing, to intercept all HTTP calls, to later retrace whatever I was doing. So let's go to the proxy. Let's open a browser that's connected to my proxy. Hopefully that works today. Sometimes it's a little bit stubborn. Please open. No, I don't want to update. Don't update just before a live demo session. Localhost 8082. OK, I'm logging in. It does not want to work with me, so we're going to try it to do it again. Yes, login, it was user. And no, yes, it's fine. Don't allow. As part of my profile, I can upload a picture. So let's upload a picture. Let's choose a file. Let's choose, which one? This one. It's not that big. Upload the file, and now as part of that, I have a picture in my profile file. Works. Great. Ship it to production. However, let's take a look at whatever the code is. And there is a problem over here, and that problem is what we call a path reversal issue. And obviously, I'm getting this hit already here. In my upload control, there's a path reversal issue. So let's watch whatever is going there, whatever is going on there. So let me enlarge this so you can actually read it. When I'm uploading an image over here, I am sending the image over as a multi-part file. And trust me, the code I'm showing you here is basically a copy and paste of a tutorial. What I'm doing here, I am taking the file. For whatever reason, I want to use the original file name because I think that's necessary. And there can be all sorts of reasons why this is necessary. And I replace all spaces with underscores. Then I look at what my upload directory is and create a new path that contains the upload directory, which is /uploads, and the name, original name of my file. I write my file. But what if the original name was something like ... etc., etc., /etc/pass or something like that. What it does in this case, if that would be possible, because the multipart file that comes in here is just a Java representation or an object representation of a POST request, HTTP request. So the name, if the name there is not sanitized or looked at, I can do this. And I traverse all the way from where I am. If I do this a gazillion times, I come back to the root, and then I go to whatever area I can get into the operating system and overload or overwrite maybe a file, depending on what user you're running this process on. Who is running Docker? Or who uses Docker files? What's the default user for a Docker image? At least you know, thank you. But look at the amount of Docker files that are there, and people just use it. But you're executing your applications as root if you don't set a specific user. So guess what? It happens a lot. And I will show you that it's quite easy to do so. If I'm going back to Burp Suite, I will go to my proxy, and I will go to my proxy history. And I will zoom in a bit. And over here, we see the POST request to upload. Yes, we see the request and the response. Let's move my request to the repeater. And now we can adjust it and redo it. The red part over here is just the stuff that is from the image. Either some stuff from the image itself, but it's not really important. The most important part are the headers over here. You see some headers, post request, blah, 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 blah. And then it over here says file name. So I can do, let's take it here. Let's do this. Let's not, and let's call it to stay in the same space. If I do this, I'm breaking outside of the upload folder. I'm still in the application area, but now I'm just dropping the image somewhere else. Let's see if that works. So if I'm now resending it over here, you will see I will get an HTTP 200 response. And if I'm going back to my application, and you will see over here in the lower parts that I just created a JPEG Foxcern that is outside of the upload folder. Which means if I can do this outside of my own upload folder, I can either overwrite things in my folder structure of my application, because that's probably where I am able to do things, or even worse, I can do parts in, for instance, the JDK overwrite, or overwrite something in the image or the runtime that I'm using it in. What should we be using is, this is an alpha feature of our plugin, fix this issue. Let's see what it does. Never do these things on stage, they say to me. But what I should do is actually inspecting if the name that comes in does not traverse to something weird, but ends up with normalized strip prefix. Well, that's not a great solution. No, it's not. It's horrible. You see, that's why it's a beta version. What I should do, for instance, is I can normalize things. So I can say, for instance, instead of writing over here, I can make something like if file, file name and path dot normalize, and normalize actually looks at if there's dot or slashes in it, where does it end up? And for instance, there starts with and then connect if it starts with, I think I can just do a string over here, upload a directory, or if it does not start with the upload directory, then I can actually write or not. So I should inspect this stuff instead of just blindly taking it into my application and using it. The other one is obviously don't use the file name at all, create a file name yourself, so then you're safe as well, but it depends on your use case. But normalization is one of the things you can do, and I'm happy that my scanner caught it as soon as I'm actually creating this, so I can, again, fix it before it hits actually my main repository. All right, let's move on to the next one. Yes, we've done this. So what is the file name? Where does it reverses to? And check if that does as well. Who of you needs to work with XML still? Like importing XML? You see, a lot of people. If I go to new conferences, people say like, "But we use JSON." Sure, whatever. Greenfield application, sure, buddy. But anyway, one of the things that you can do in XML are using external entities and using doc type definitions. The thing is, in Java, there are already a couple of XML parsers available. And the tutorials there are available, and you can simply use these things. The problem only is that external entities and doc type definitions are normally there to read external files and to see if the XML that is incoming, if it's correct or not as you expect it according to specification. This is considered a feature. But if you're not using it, and in many cases nowadays, I'm not sure if we're using it, it depends again on your use case, this can also be misused because an external entity does not need to be a DTD file. Let me show you. So by default, this is something specifically in the Java parsers that is by default a feature, and it is set to true. So let me find out where I have my... Did I already fix it? No, all right, come on. Use hard-coded SQL injection, trust. It doesn't. Either it doesn't recognize it, or I fixed it already. The thing is, if I am going to one of my examples, this is YAML, and I export my orders, this would be a normal way of ordering it. My orders are just an ID, an order date, whatever. This looks all fine. But I can misuse these doc type definitions in this way. So what I'm doing here, I am creating a doc type definition in my XML, and the entity, I'm creating an entity that is marked to as XXE. That's the variable it's marked to, and in this case, I'm pointing to a system file /hc/passwd. I can use this variable instead of here putting in the product name. I'm just putting in the content of my passwd file. If you have a normal parser, so the SAX parser or the DOM parser that are part of the JDK, this works by default. This means that if I go back to my application and I go to my orders, there are a bunch of orders, but I can import XML. So let's do that. Let's see where I drop this. Over here, examples. And let's right away do the xxe.xml. If I submit this, it doesn't. Then probably doc type definition is disallowed. Then I already fixed it. Yes. That's the thing when you do a demo more than once, then you might forget to reverse it. Let's see where if I can find it. Exporter. Yes. I will show you why it doesn't work. Because I deliberately set these two lines in. I disallow doc types, and I disallow external general entities. And I need to do that on purpose, because if not, if I just move these things away, so these are features, or these are a feature that I need to by default need to switch off or switch on, is how you depend it. And I rerun this again, then I'm able to do this. Yeah. Put it on with new files. It's great. Cool. So my orders, import, choose file, And let's go to the xxe.xml and submit. And now what you see is that this is basically the body of my passwd file. So that means you can disclose information that is not part of the scope of your application and disclose it somewhere or even send it to other places. And that's because by default this is considered a feature in the XML parsers, but you should not do that. So if you, who of you also programs in things like C#? Yeah, somebody. In C#, the default parsers have this set off by default. So they have secure defaults in this case. The Java parsers that are there with your Java distributions have it on, so you need to set this off to make sure that you cannot go outside of the scope of the actual XML file and use external entities to disclose information from the outside. That's also the reason why I didn't catch it, because I already fixed it. So that also sees how it works. So to do this, I need to set the feature disallow doc types to true and set the feature external general entities to false. So it doesn't allow general entities anymore and it disallow doc types. In that case, you're only containing it to your own file, but you need to specifically set that unless you're using a library, but then you need to know what the defaults are for that library, which in most cases, most of you read all of the documentation of all the libraries that you're using, right? Exactly. Great. Then we're fine. Let's skip this one because of time. Yep. Who of you is great at cryptography? That's what I thought. One person. Every time when you need to know something about cryptography, go to that man. The thing is, what do we need to use? Do we need to use hashing or do we need to use encryption? Because these are two different things. Don't use them, don't intertwine them. These are different things, and you need to figure out if you need to use them. What you need to use, you need to know if you need to retrieve data and put it back into original state, yes or no. In the case of passwords, that's an absolute no, because if the hashing always contains or always creates the same hash, you can just compare the hashes, and that is fine. So hashing is good if you want to store things like password or credentials. Hopefully you don't need to do that yourself, as in you have a service to do that, but also service can be breached, not naming anything like Okta or something like that. But say you need to do that yourself. What kind of algorithm is currently the best algorithm to do that? Yep, and we make design decisions. Currently, this is Argon2 ID. And yes, there are different things like PBKDF2, scrypt, bcrypt, and they can be used if Argon2 ID is not available. Argon2 is a award-winning algorithm for hashing, and there are multiple ways of using Argon2. Argon2I is very good at preventing side channel attacks. Argon2D is good at preventing CPU memory attacks, or CPU attacks. Argon2 ID is a trade-off between the two. But it's not just using this algorithm. You also need to use what currently is considered by the industry a good standard of how much memory should I use, how much parallelization should I use, and what all these kind of settings to either strengthen or weakening your password hashing algorithm. These are things that, for instance, the OWASP Foundation looks at. And if you look at the OWASP password cheat sheet, these are the minimal settings. So if you want to do more layers, then you can use less memory, etc., etc. For Argon2 ID, these are the settings. But this is something that changes over time. So first of all, if I have an application that is old, it's quite easy to change that. In my controller, I have, or in my configuration, I have a security configuration. And as part of my security configuration, I currently use PBKDF2 password encoder. One of the things I can do, I can download I can import the Argon2 password encoder. And password encoder is technically the wrong name, but don't get me started on that. and then put the right variables in. But, there's always a but. If you do this, what is your strategy on updating? I mean, you probably are using something. Your passwords you use it are already there. If it's a greenfield application, it's fine. But this is something you, as a developer, need to think of like, okay, works on my machine now. Yeah, like ship it, and in 2 years you need to change this because we need to do up to newer standards. How am I able to update that? Well, there definitely are certain things to. There are certain ways to do that. You can invalidate all passwords and let every user do it again, if that is possible. But that depends on your strategy or on your user base. However, this is something we need to think of. So this is more from a design principle, but also from an update principle, because what is safe now or considered safe now might not be safe tomorrow. And especially if you work for institutions like banks, insurance companies, but moreover the government, you need to work to certain standards. So think of your update strategy before you start programming this. Secondly, we were talking about, hello? Yes. Help. Yes, there we are. I wrote a blog post around it to see like, hey, how can you do these kind of things? What is currently a great way to do password hashing? What if Argon 2 is not available? How can I configure PBKDF2 or ASCRIPT to that? I will publish the slides later, so no need to write down all of this. But next one is encryption. That is if we have data that we encrypt in a certain way, but we need to be able to retrieve it back to the original data. So these are two different things, hashing and encrypting data. What is currently a good algorithm to do, or pretty much the standard to do data encryption, for instance, say credit card numbers? Does anybody have any idea? AES, thank you. It definitely is AES. AES is considered one of the better performing and usable symmetric algorithms to do so. But if you look at what the consideration for the OWASP Foundation are, is like use at least a key of 128 bits, ideally 265, and use a secure mode. And what is a secure mode? Well, there are different ways of doing this thing, and I'm not going into what the different modes are, but basically it comes down to use GCM or CCM because they provide integrity, authenticity, and confidentiality. So they make sure that that's the case. But even if you do that, again, that is safe now. How are you going to update this, or how are you resilient enough that if your manager comes back to you next month and say, okay, we need to update to this new algorithm, how can we do that? Do you have things in place? Can you keep the shop open while you do that? It is not a one-time implementation, and in many companies that I work for, but also consult for, you see that this is it's in production, and yeah, I don't know how to change it, and we have actually never looked at it. Luckily, again, I can do this during development, but I can also look at my application. For instance, in my CI pipeline, it's the same application. I connected this to the GitHub. Oh, this is only my Maven part. Let me just go back to my application, and let's see what it already says. It says to me like, "Hey Brian, all great, but you are using a broken or risky cryptographic algorithm." Because in this case, I am using DES, which is an outdated version of, basically the predecessor of AES, with ECB. Even if I'm going to use another one, let's say I have a new service that uses AES, but with the wrong, in an incorrect mode, let's call it like that, then if I rescan it, it probably will come back with, hey, nice, you're using AES, but you're still using or it's already highlighted over here. But over here it says, hey, inadequate padding for AES, and a user this is a medium vulnerability, other was a high risk vulnerability, broken or risky cryptographic algorithm, and in this case it says CBC mode uses in this cipher is not provided integrity, because in this case I'm using AES with CBC. Again, I understand as a developer, you're not doing this on a daily basis, so it's nice that there are tools available that scan this for you, and you get pointed to points so that, okay, maybe we need to update so at least it's visible to you. Because if you don't know, and in many cases we don't see this on a daily basis, we have no clue that this is outdated. So this is very helpful, at least to me. Again, I wrote something about it, what kind of strategies you can use for this. So one of the last things I want to call out are libraries and frameworks, because if this is your Java application, probably part of that application is just your code. How much do you think is your code compared to all the stuff that we borrow from the internet and are from Spring Boot starters? 10%? I think it's adequate. It depends, obviously. But in most cases, if we use a Spring Boot application, it's probably something like this. This is your code, this is the rest of the application. We looked at your code. We definitely looked at your code. You probably have something like code reviews in place, right? Who does code reviews? Okay, the rest of you does pair programming, I assume. But we take good care of that code. But how about the rest? How about the libraries and frameworks that are there? I mean, are there people still using Spring Boot 2.6 or 2.7 or you're not filmed, I'm filmed, it's fine. But guess what? It comes in with a ton of dependencies. I wrote a tweet a couple of years ago that I wrote a Hello World application in Spring Boot with just one endpoint, and that was 4 lines of code. Of course, it's silly because it just prints Hello World. But how many lines of code is my fat jar? It was about 4 million. Just saying. So one of these things, the problem is, for instance, consuming YAML. One of the libraries that are there for you, provided to you, for instance, by Spring Boot. It's used by SnakeYAML. SnakeYAML is a well-known library, and up to, I think it was Spring Boot 3.2, it was provided with with SnakeYAML 1.26, 1.33. In any case, the one version of that. The problem with SnakeYAML 1 version is that most people might not take YAML from the outside and try to parse it. So it was not a really hard or a really imminent problem. But the thing is, you could. And if you looked at what the tools say about how to do that, basically say YAML, new YAML, my object is YAML.load. The problem is that input stream is getting into your system, parsed to object, so it's part of your memory, and then then you try to mold it into your my object. You try to cast it. So if it's not a my object, you get a class cast exception. However, if it is an object, something else, that is also part of your class path, it can already execute other things, execute code. So, just want to show you that if I'm not going to demo this, or I'm not going to live demo this because of time, but say, in the same sense as the XML file, this is the YAML version of it. I can annotate it for SnakeYAML with whatever kind of object it needs to be. This is legal in SnakeYAML. And then I can just do this, and it will magically mold it into an export order. But in the same way, I can do horrible other things, like maybe I have a gadget.class, and that can execute code whenever it's instantiated, and do open calculator. Obviously, nobody creates that gadget himself. But what we've seen in the wild is things like this. Up to Java 10, there was a script engine. So if I just assume YAML and I load YAML in the way that I showed you on the previous slide, and this is the YAML file that I load, it's valid YAML. But it launches a script launcher, it looks at the URL class loader, and it tries to access a URL and maybe download something. Or even worse, if I have the JDBC Rosette implementation available, then I could do an LDAP connection. Oh wait, I think we saw that before with log4j. LDAP inclusion. So the problem is that like SnakeYAML is too wide. It does not actually check if this is available in your system, and a third party or a user can input this YAML file. It will do horrible things. However, if you look at the documentation, and we all read the documentation. It clearly states it's not safe to call YAML.load with any data received from an untrusted source. And we all read the documentation, right? We all knew that. If you want to have some fun, look at the thread that this was called up on in the Git repo, and the owner said, "This is not a mistake, this is a feature." And he kept doing that because you should read the documentation. However, all the tutorials on the web said you can just do YAML.load because that works. This was fixed in snake.yaml.2, obviously, but that comes with by default with, I think it is Spring Boot 3.2 or something like that. And that is because in Spring Boot you have the Spring parent. The Spring parent has the Spring parent dependencies, which has a whole lot of versions that were included in the dependency management part of Maven. Which means even if lower things are using a transitive dependency to snake.yaml 2.x, the dependency management part from Spring Boot will overwrite that to the version that is compatible with that parent of Spring Boot. Meaning, the first thing that you should do is update that if you want to go beyond that. So I have 1 minute left, so I will not go into sensitive data, but I will show how to get started. I want to end with that. First thing you should do is look at what is the version of your major framework. If that is Spring Boot, try to upload it to the most recent version that is stable. And if you can, and if it's hard to do because you're way outdated, look at things like OpenRewrite that have recipes that can automatically do that and rewrite your stuff for you. Yes, you still need a good test suite for that, because sometimes it breaks things, most of the times it doesn't. From that point on, look at things at what kind of libraries and frameworks do you have underneath, and try to update these. For instance, in my application, I have Log4j. I have Spring Beans with that, which has a problem. I have Tomcat Embedded, an H2 problem, Timeleaf that is outdated. Most of these things will already be saved if I'm updating Spring. But some of them not, because I did that manually. Try to update these. Next to that, look at your code. Scan your code and see if there are problems there, and go there step by step by step, and don't try to do it all at once. So start with your larger frameworks, then work your way down on your dependencies, because your dependencies are far more impactful than probably your own code. But the code is something that you signed off on. So yes, look at that. Try to do that as soon as possible in your application by, for instance, using a thing like this. And this is obviously our plugin for IntelliJ, but there are many other plugins that look at, hey, what is the flow and where is the problem and what can it happen? And go from there to step by step, try to make your application a little bit more secure. And you need to do that in a cadence, as not what is safe now or what library, for instance, is safe today might be vulnerable tomorrow. So it might make sense to do this scan automatically in a certain pace as every week or every month or every day, and see what kind of newer versions are out to update that to make sure that you are on time. Because we saw in the beginning how a building was built, and we know that every building or every property that, for instance, we live in needs maintenance and sometimes needs some renovation. And same happens to your car, but also the same needs to happen to your software. So I want to end with that. These are just some snippets that you can do. There are a ton of other things that I can mention, but I want to end with that. If you want to reach me, you can reach me on preferably Blue Sky, because I'm not a big fan of what used to be Twitter anymore. I will publish my slides on my Blue Sky account and on my LinkedIn account, so I will make sure that this is there, and obviously the whole talk is recorded and will be published later. I want to end with the last thing. I do have stickers. You don't need to do a prize or a contest on that. I just drop them here if you like a sticker, and that's it. Hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference. Hope it was useful. Cheers.